Corporations are in the business of turning speculative ideas into new realities. But for every doubling of a company's size, it's matched with a 3% reduction in its growth potential. In this show, we talk to Martin Reeves, who has studied how imagination works in organizations and how to get more ideas flowing to prevent that decline.
Hey folks, welcome to The Evolving Leader. I'm Scott Allender.
And I'm John Gomes.
Are you sure? It took you a minute to get there.
Well, you're just so quick.
How are you doing today, John? How are you feeling?
I'm feeling energized, which is not always what I would say on a Friday afternoon. But for some reason, it's been a great week. It really feels like we're back in the swing of things now, where everybody's returning to work after the holiday break. And feeling great. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling really energized too. Looking forward to a much needed weekend, a very full week, but a very productive week. So grateful for that. And I'm very excited, as I always am, to be back here with you today and talking to one of our esteemed guests. Today we are joined by Martin Reeves. Martin is an MD and senior partner at BCG and also leads the BCG Henderson Institute, which is BCG's vehicle for exploring ideas from beyond the world of business. His consulting career has largely focused on strategy with an equal emphasis on idea, origination, development, and practical application. He's written a book called The Imagination Machine, along with Jack Fuller, and that book draws on real experiences and insights of CEOs across several industries, as well as lessons from neuroscience, philosophy, and psychology to dive deeper into the mechanics of imagination. Martin, welcome to The Evolving Leader.
Thanks for inviting me.
Martin, how are you feeling?
Well, it's a leadership podcast, so I guess I'm not allowed to say I'm feeling sleepy and lethargic, having gotten up early on a Friday morning. So I'm brimming with energy and ideas.
I think we'd like you to be, candid about how you're actually feeling. So no, that's good. That's good because you can't change what you're not paying attention to. So welcome to the show, and let's start perhaps with getting to know you a bit because how Scott has set you up in terms of the kind of convergent space of all of these different ideas sounds fascinating. It sounds like you've got a very eclectic interest in various things. So it'd be good to get a sense of your background and perhaps what brought you to writing this book.
Well, Scott gave, I guess, the sanitized, sensible version. I sort of think of myself as primarily a failed musician and secondly a failed biologist and thirdly an accidental career business strategist. And indeed, I've always been a bit of a jack of all trades, and so I've studied mathematics and physics and chemistry and biology and Japanese and anything else I could manufacture an excuse to study, and I find that quite useful actually in my current profession, which is as a strategist, it's essentially problem solving, drawing upon many traditions and. How I arrived at the book was, as a professional strategy consultant, I found that it was really very hard to change a company's strategy unless you first stretch people's minds. And then that got me into the mental side of strategy. And I discovered that while there were sort of self-help creativity books and so on, there wasn't really the book that I needed, which is how to stimulate and cultivate and harness the entire cycle of harnessing the value of imaginative ideas. So that's the book that we set out to write.
And I mean, this really resonates strongly with Scott and I because we work with lots of organizations where there is really an absence of imagination amongst all levels of the organization and primarily because it's not encouraged, it's not seen as necessary. So, And it feels like a huge wasted opportunity because we've all got imaginations, but they've been suppressed in most organizations. And to talk a little bit about why you think that is.
Well, there's a paradox around imagination. I would argue that historically, corporations have done more to change the world through the medium of ideas than any poet or visionary. The poets and the visionaries articulated ideas, but rarely sparked the revolution to actually have them implemented. Corporations, in a sense, on long time scales, are in the business of creating new realities out of things that start off as speculative abstractions. The problem is, and we have some sort of hard data and analysis on this, is that the growth potential of companies, what we call their vitality, as opposed to their current performance, declines the bigger and the older they get. So every doubling of size of a company leads to a 3 percentage point decline in its growth potential. So there's a sort of a gravity, if you like, of unimaginativeness. The good news is that it's not an inevitability. The scatter is rather wide. So another way of framing what the book is about, it's about how to defy the gravity of descent into the realm of efficiency, financialization, and the disappearance of the imaginative spark that is at the beginning of the history of any company.
So it's easy to think about, harnessing imagination as, being solely a mental or psychological process, but your research is, as I understand it, has revealed something else. What have you found, and what does that mean in terms of how this notion should be challenged?
So it's fun to write the book as a former scientist, and I wrote the book with somebody who studied philosophy, psychology, and theology. And so it was good to delve into the history of how I thought about imagination. And it turns out that the Romantics did us an enormous disservice in the way that they treated the topic of imagination, because they gave us this idea that it was very individual. Imaginativeness was something that only occurred in the minds of select individuals with a special genius. That it was totally unruly. The imagination would be an instantaneous spark at an unpredictable moment. So it gave us the idea that we couldn't possibly harness imagination. Whereas I think imagination is very useful. It's a universal human trait. Mm-hmm. As far as we can tell, other animals are not able to say, what if I was a goldfish not living in water or not living in this particular bowl? Humans have this ability to create counterfactual worlds. Immensely useful in business because it's the root of innovation. We can't change the world unless we first change what we see in our minds. But we didn't really have a playbook. But we set out to be guided by what the science says about imagination. And we do know some things about the physiology and the genetics of imagination, not a lot. But also to be pragmatic in that we chose to define imagination as something that could be harnessed at least to the same degree as any other unpredictable aspect of human affairs. And we don't shy away from trying to understand consumer psychology or team motivation or leadership behavior. So why should we shy away from having a process for imagination? So we see imagination as being both physical and mental, because if an idea is not tested in the world, it remains some sort of internal vision or fantasy. We see it as being tremendously social. Ideas that don't spread remain as private indulgences.
Can we just delve into some of the neuroscience and research that you've uncovered that underpins your thinking?
Yes. So there's some interesting work by the neuroscientist Carl Friston that essentially says what's the most atomistic explanation of the function of the brain. And in his view, the brain is a surprise minimization machine. So the idea is that we have an internal model of the world, a mental model, and we update that to keep our mental model in accordance with reality for the purpose of guiding our survival. And so where does the need to update our mental model come from? The key idea is that it comes from surprise or anomaly, something that doesn't fit between our experience and our mental image of the world. And once we've received the surprise, we can do a number of things with that. The simplest thing we can do is to update our mental model to say, well, let me have a better model of reality. Another thing we can do is we can refocus. We can say, well, let's take a closer look at that and confirm whether that exception that we saw is actually an exception. And we can move in the world. We can relocate ourselves. We can actually manipulate our sensory input. So the idea is the embodied brain, not just the brain. We can actually move and change our sensory input. We can communicate to others. We can say, "Did you see that?" We can be the inspiration for other people's manipulation of their mental models and create shared mental models. And also, of course, we have hands. So young children, when they first develop, they have a period where they're exclusively focused on people's faces. But the next phase in child development is when you put a camera on a child's head to see what it's seeing. It becomes obsessed by its hands, by its instrumentality, and of course we can shape we can shape the world. We can experiment. We can manipulate our environment. So essentially, we took these ideas and others like these and put them into a corporate context. And the translation was actually not that hard, because we already knew from our research that corporations have a great tendency as they grow to become very introverted. Well, if you're mainly concerned with what's going on inside the walls of the corporation, you're not going to be exposing yourself to the surprise and the stimulus and the inspiration that could spark your imagination. So that's a very easy translation. How can you be less introverted as a company? And then we also knew that companies have a hard time sometimes distinguishing mental models from facts. For instance, we say, we're in the podcast industry. It sounds almost like a fact. But we could also equally say we're in the entertainment industry. We're in the applied psychology industry. There are all sorts of ways of framing what we're doing here today. So we must so self-awareness that our mental models are merely models. Often a company has a dominant mental model. This is the way things work in our business, and of course we can easily say, well, let's have alternative mental models. Let's have a range of mental models, and so on. So the translation worked very well. And when we went out and did our field work in business, we actually found some companies implicitly applying these techniques. But there's a stage beyond being great as a company, which is being systematically great, having codified why it is what you're doing is working. So in a sense, the book is a work of codification.
Thank you, and I think it ties in with a lot of other neuroscientists that we've had on the show talking about this kind of constructed form of experience, with the brain being this prediction machine, and variance being where consciousness suddenly comes online. Everything's automated up to that period.
Yes, I mean the physicist Gell-Mann, I think, wrote a little book which was called something like "Wouldn't Physics Be Complicated If Particles Could Think?" And it would, of course, be even more complicated if they could act, if they had instrumentality. But humans have both. So on top of the the descriptive brain science of what the brain does, of course, we can run the machine backwards. We can create internal surprise. We can, through analogy, for example, we can strike an analogy and surprise ourselves, change our own mental models, which change our actions, which change how we communicate, and we can shape reality at two levels through that, with our hands, but also by communicating these internal models, which can be counterfactual. We can imagine things that could be the case that are not actually yet the case, and that's really another tie-in with the business research, because the strategies of small companies and large companies used to be fundamentally different. It used to be that small companies essentially were searching for a successful business model. It was a search problem, and large companies were essentially optimizing the model that the founders had discovered. So it was an optimization problem. The problem now is that competitive advantage decays so rapidly that every large company also needs to search for new models. They need to become an encore company. So they need to recreate that instrumentality, that ability to shape their visions and through them shape the world that their founders and the disruptive startups that are challenging them have.
And it strikes an interesting dilemma, because as a business strategist, both yourself and your organization you work for, you're constantly dealing with that perceived risk to the existing status quo.
Perceived risk.
Perceived risk,
exactly.
Yeah, but it's quite strong, isn't it? So
that's what I call the baseline fallacy. I mean, there is this idea that the status quo business model is the risk-free bet, is the safe bet, and of course that's true until it becomes not true, at which point it becomes too late to realize the fact that at some point it will become untrue. And so one of the sort of hard analytical foundations of the book is the modeling of what we call the fade rate of competitive advantage. So if you look at excess returns, if you're outperforming your competitors in an industry, how long does that last? And the fade rate was such that leadership used to last, or competitive advantage used to last about a decade on average for public companies in the 1980s. But today that number has dramatically come down to about 1 year on average, meaning that companies do need to reinvent themselves, which means that this sort of shortcut, this shorthand that the existing model, the status quo model, is the safe bet, becomes a very dangerous belief in today's business environment.
And meanwhile, we know that CEOs are getting progressively frustrated with their company's inability to reimagine themselves. So, I mean, is it largely because just as our brains are, as you say, surprise mitigation machines, does the organization itself end up organizing in such a way to become a surprise mitigation machine, therefore not allowing for these new models and new shifts and mindsets that would unlock new business models?
Well, the hierarchical organization and the large enterprise is a wonderful human invention. It's enabled us to scale ideas and reshape the world and drive down the costs of things that used to be, things like shoes and food used to be sort of major portions of our income. These have been massively driven down in cost in relation to income. So all of that is great. One of the downsides of these large industrial organizations is that they have tremendous cognitive inertia. Once a shared mental model of how business works is embedded, it's often hard to escape that rut. Now, interestingly, BCG's founder, Bruce Henderson, who was one of the founders of the modern discipline of competitive strategy in the early 60s, wrote about this. He said that it's easy to become a prisoner of the assumptions which underpinned our historic success, unwittingly. Often we're not aware that we're prisoners. This becomes a central finding, a central issue in today's business environment. So, if you like, a lot of what we wrote in the book is about how to escape those formerly useful but now limiting mental ruts.
So your book does a wonderful job of outlining how to kind of harness and scale imagination and creativity in a systemized way. You lay out a 6-step process for doing this. Can you give us a quick roundup of that?
Yes. So the first step is, we call it the seduction. It's essentially the seduction to rethink, to reimagine, and in a word, it's surprise. And surprise largely comes in 3 forms, which are accidents. You were trying to do one thing and another thing happened. Anomalies, something that doesn't fit the pattern, which you won't see if you just measure averages. It's the importance of measuring anomalies and outliers. And then analogies, by comparing something to something else and saying, could this be, like this other thing? Could a hospital be like a health club? You actually see correspondences that you can entertain, and you can ask yourselves, could that be the case? And so, step 1 is all about exposure to surprise and what it takes to not only notice surprise, but to care about surprise. Because once we see a surprise, we have to care about it. We have to have aspirations or aggravations that cause us to say, I want to do something about that surprise. The second step is the big idea. It's the mental part of the imagination. It's the part of the imagination that people maybe loosely refer to as the imagination. And now we all have this propensity, but a lot of us use it in a very intuitive fashion. And if we want to use it socially and systematically, then we must understand something about the discipline of counterfactual thinking. So interestingly, in business, we're all trained in deductive thinking, in analytical thinking. I think the last time I was formally taught anything on counterfactual thinking, imaginative thinking, was was probably in kindergarten. Our education system just doesn't really focus on it. But things like visual representation of a business model, repermutation of the elements of a business model, the application of constraints to force new counterfactual thinking, imaginative thinking. There's a whole discipline of counterfactual thinking that companies can teach themselves, and a few companies embrace, but most don't. Systematically, that is. The third stage is the collision. The collision is where, so if you like, we've gone from the surprise of reality into the internal environment of the mind, and now we're emerging back into physical reality. It's when we collide an idea with reality. We didn't call it experimentation because verification of whether our idea works or not is only one aspect of what's going on. Most new ideas in business fail, but they generate new surprises. When we give an impulse to reality by testing a new prototype, we normally find something strange about why it didn't work. And a lot of innovation processes are designed only to focus on success signals. We think that so-called failure signals and the ability to generate new surprises are just as important. Then the fourth step is really important, which is what we call the epidemic, in the good sense of the word, spreading ideas. So a lot of the modern corporation is almost designed to prevent the spread of ideas. Turf wars between departments and separate accounting and specialized functional language and organizational divisions and communication barriers. The divisionalized company will often have difficulty creating that epidemic of an idea. And there's a very important philosophical idea here, which we also had conversations with philosophers. And one of the key problems of philosophy is intersubjectivity, which is I'm thinking something intangible, and I think you are talking about the same thing, but how would we know? Because we're comparing an intangible idea. And it's a very important, it sounds abstruse, but it's a very important problem to solve if you want collective embrace of an idea. And so essentially, the chapter on the epidemic is about how many ways are there of making sure that what you're thinking is what I'm thinking, and we're sharing and progressing and evolving an imaginative idea. And two of the key processes that occur there, one of them is the uptake or the spread of an idea, but the other one is the evolution of an idea as it is embraced by people with different cognitive makeups, the sort of explorer types or the producer types or the skeptic types. They all have something different to add to the evolution of an idea. The fifth stage I was most fascinated by because, at least in my limited knowledge as a strategist, I'd seen less about this than any other aspect of the book, and that is codification, which is, so you have a successful idea, people within your company believe in it, and you now need it to work in a new circumstance in China with employees that were not exposed to the original idea development process. What rule book do you give them? Or what guidance can you give them? What codification as to how to replicate success? It's a bit like, writing a franchise manual for a hamburger restaurant. If you wrote down absolutely everything, you'd end up with tomes that were completely unreadable and unusable. If, on the other hand, you just said, go for it, believe in yourself, it will all work out, smile, it would be too zen to have any practical impact. So how many ways are there of codifying success? I really enjoyed writing that chapter. And then the last one is encore, which is this very hard act of success is we're in an Andy Warhol world. Every company will be successful with something for a short period of time. Success is not rare. Success in terms of performance. But sustained success is becoming harder and harder. So really, how do you become an encore company? How do you despecialize? How do you forget the underpinnings of your previous success so that you can actually embrace new success? And how can you do that before the burning platform? How do you do that preemptively so you have a reasonable chance of crossing from one peak to another?
I love these steps. This makes so much sense to me. But how do we get better at this? What are some ways that, for a listener right now to be thinking about what would need to happen in my organization to adopt some of these strategies and go through these processes?
Well, I think in a large company with a lot of complexity, a lot of noise, a lot of activity, a lot of constraints, what you can't do is to say, okay, here's the 97-point agenda, do it all. But I think one of the abbreviations is leadership behaviors, because a lot of the things we've spoken about today depend upon culture in the sense of the way that we think and do things around here, and leaders set the tone for that. So, for example, two of the biggest killers of imagination are fear and complacency. And leaders can magnify fear by saying, "Oh my God, we're under attack. We're behind this quarter." We can create an environment of fear fairly easily. A successful company has a natural tendency towards complacency, which is doesn't need fixing. It ain't broke. And leaders can either reinforce that, or like Jeff Bezos at Amazon, they can say, "Well, no, stay hungry. Day one psychology. We could lose it all at any moment in time. Let's stay vigilant." And when I spoke to entrepreneurs, we spoke to a lot of entrepreneurs as part of the book research. Interestingly, one thing they all shared was fear of becoming complacent, fear that the next generation of recruits regards the way that things operate around here as a fact. I'm joining a company that knows what they're doing, and therefore it's not my role to question. They all saw that as the beginning of the death of entrepreneurialism, and they all feared that. So that's one set of leadership behaviors. Another one is anticipation. A crisis is tremendously motivational for a company, and most companies will react to a crisis fairly rapidly, fairly efficiently. But if you wait until that sense of crisis has permeated an organization before you change your model, before you change your business, if you don't anticipate, you're taking a big risk, because the big bet may go wrong. The fear and the stress of reacting to the crisis may smother imagination. So again, leaders can say, "Yeah, we're doing great with this model, but where's the encore? We need 3 encore candidates," and they can encourage that. I think one can, this is my word, but a lot of the leaders we talked to essentially had some version of what I call an artificial crisis, which is, there was a little bit of a sense of complacency, and there are a number of techniques for waking an organization up. And my favorite is Nitin Paranjpe. He's now the COO of Unilever, but he was the CEO of Hindustan Lever, which was a very, very high-performing subsidiary in India, a very aspirational company. But around 2008, he noticed that the company was still performing great, but it was going off the boil. It was hitting some sort of plateau. So his artificial crisis consisted of sending every person in the company, including the caretakers and the receptionists, into the field to answer 5 questions, and which we talk about in the book. And question 3 is, what surprised you? Interestingly, in line with our sort of framework. And they came back with thousands of ideas, and amongst these ideas were ideas that there were some ideas about distribution coverage, which essentially broke the stagnation that they were entering. Another thing that Paranjpe talks about and other leaders talk about is heroic goals. We often say that a goal should be realistic as one of its attributes. I think some of the leaders we spoke to would argue that they should be unrealistic, because a realistic goal has the merit of achievability, but it has the drawback that if you decode what achievable means, it means achievable within the bounds of current mental and business models, and so a ridiculous target, a very stretch target, forces you to rethink. So it's if you like, it's the psychology of embracing a constraint in order to force new paths of mental development, and then. Narratives and heroes. One of the most impressive companies that we came across in that respect was the company Recruit in Japan, whose entire personnel system is based upon creating a culture of entrepreneurialism. In fact, when I walked in the door of the company, they invited me to spend a week with them They said, well, first, let us introduce you to the most important people in the company. I thought they were going to introduce me to the board or something. They were introducing me to their entrepreneurial heroes, the people that had created new businesses. And the idea is that if you don't positively recognize these people, you'd go the way of most companies, which is you celebrate size of the division, historic successes, number of people working for you, as opposed to creators of new things. So they actually, almost deliberately cultivate narratives and heroes around creating new businesses. So that's just a selection of things that leaders can do that directly impact all of the crucial steps that we talked about.
You talk about play and the importance of it. I think you describe it as de-risked accelerated learning. And, very few companies come to mind where this is embraced. I mean, Lego is one, but then, they make something to play with. So it's not such a leap to imagine that they might embrace that. Advertising agencies, generating ideas while they're playing baseball seems, comes to mind as well. Where else? Talk about the importance of play, but also where you're seeing it being adopted.
Yes. Well, to escape from ruts, to escape from mental models, you've got to propose things which risk seeming ridiculous in the context of a very established way of thinking. And the established way of thinking can be very normative. I'm sure we've all experienced situations where people have shot down ideas, embryonic ideas, as being vague, impractical. But actually, that's the way that ideas start. If you're not tolerant of that, you'll have no ideas, or the ideas will be killed at birth. In fact, one of the things we did to illustrate this, which people can find on the book website, theimaginationmachine.org, is we created what we call a napkin gallery. So the apocryphal napkin that inventors sketch the first sketches of their inventions on, it turns out that actually there are a lot of those. There are a lot of napkins with the first sketches of, particle accelerators and things like this. And so we used some art gallery software to create an online gallery of the first worldly instantiations and expressions of ideas that changed the world resulting from business. So, the first sketch by Alexander Graham Bell of the telephone. And we have a little gallery card that doesn't give you enormous amounts of information, but it evokes the cognitive environment of the time, how implausible this idea seemed in the context of the time. And we give people that are interested tours of the gallery where we remind them how ideas start. And then we have a discussion with them about, do you have any napkins? If you had some napkins in your company, would you know? And, if somebody gave you a napkin of a sketch of, how your industry could be transformed, what would you do with it? Would you ask for 20 more, or would you throw it in the bin? So that sort of tension between being practical and effective and efficient on the one hand, a characteristic of large companies, and being exploratory on the other, is very much the central paradox at the core of business strategy. And one way of creating comfort with discomfort is through play. Children are not afraid at all to ask, why not and what if. But as adults, we, especially in the context of large corporations, that instinct becomes smaller and smaller. So after years of struggling with this, I sort of concluded that you can't stretch your strategy unless you stretch your mind. So I created a series of what I called pre-strategy games. I now call them imagination games. And the games are designed to create a playful environment, and in the biological sense of, play being pleasurable, spontaneous, accelerated, de-risked learning. These are designed to expose the unspoken assumptions of our mental models and to create a safe environment where we can explore other assumptions. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So one of the games, the simplest game, the icebreaker game, if you like, is called the anti-company game, or the inverted company game. And the idea here is you create a list of everything which is sacred to the company, what you do, what you'd never do, the assumptions underpinning your success, the key elements of your identity. And then you create, as near as you can, the exact mirror image of that. You create the list which is the anti-company. And then, not jokingly, but, deadly seriously, you create the best possible business case for the anti-company. There's usually a lot of laughter. There's usually taboos that get broken. But out of this hilarity, this playful environment, certain ideas start to open up. It's a good sort of a pre-exercise stretching technique, and then we have others which are more detailed. For instance, what I call the maverick game. So it turns out that you may not have heard of them, but on the edge of any industry, there are usually tens or sometimes hundreds of small companies which are taking a bet against your view of the future, taking a bet against your business model. And the most typical responses to these mavericks are not to notice them, because they're so small they're irrelevant, or to deliberately ignore them. After all, most startups fail. Or to instantly judge them. Yeah, they don't really understand the business, But the alternative is to say, well, how would you know whether their model is ridiculous, being steeped as you are in your own business? And so, the game is to say, well, supposing that they have the right bet on the future, what are the consequences for our business, and what is the best possible business case we can make for their bet against us? And once you've created that playground, that safe space for exploration, then you start to be able to tap into your employees' considerable knowledge of the weaknesses and blind spots of your company and the possibility of alternatives. Then if you do your strategy exercise, having played this in a couple of other games, the openness to new possibilities will be much greater, and therefore you're much less likely to come out with some incrementally different version of the strategy that you entered the process with.
Hi everyone, I'm Phil Kirby, producer of The Evolving Leader. It seems almost unbelievable to be saying this, but here we are now in season 4 of the podcast. Just incredible. Time has absolutely flown. And so we can continue to evolve, we would really love it if you could give us just 3 or 4 minutes of your time to complete our listener survey using the link in the show notes. While you're feeling generous, please also go to Apple Podcast and leave us a 5-star rating and a review. Thanks for listening.
You mentioned that crisis can be an inflection point for reimagination. I was curious what you've been observing during the pandemic. What are some examples of companies who may have been really strained in the pandemic that did brilliant jobs of reimagining themselves?
You're right to connect the word crisis and imagination. We often think about resilience or crisis strategy as being about the avoidance of damage, but really there are 3 stages in leveraging a crisis to advantage. The interesting thing about crises is that if you wait for long enough, and this applies to COVID too, as well as the 2008 financial crisis and the SARS crisis and every other crisis we looked at. Mm-hmm. If you wait long enough, somebody starts to call the crisis an opportunity. And we also know from our macro analysis that the performance spread between companies in an industry increases by about 50% on average during a crisis. So in other words, the separation between winners and losers and the emergence of new winners is one of the characteristics of a crisis. So you could think about it as a race to optimism. And there are really, in other words, it's a race to who starts calling the crisis an opportunity first. And there are really 3 phases of that. One of them is the preparation for the crisis and the buffering of the shock. So some companies are almost demolished by a crisis, and others are easily able to survive the onslaught. Then the second period is about adaptation, which is circumstances are changing. We had the fastest slowdown in economic history, recent economic history, and the fastest recovery in recent economic history. Some companies tracked that extremely fast, and others didn't. But then, another interesting aspect of a crisis is that crises are not just cyclical. There's not a departure from normality and then a return to the previous normality. What returns is altered. You don't return to anything. You enter altered circumstances, so we are in altered circumstances, right? We're working from home. Part of that is probably here to stay. We're communicating virtually. Part of that is here to stay. E-commerce received a massive uptick. That's probably here to stay. We've seen even the education and the healthcare segments, which are normally massively resistant to change. We've even seen change in the use of virtual tools there. And on many dimensions, we've seen change. And some companies are just merely coping with that, and other companies are embracing new realities. And so some of the things that we saw happening during the crisis, we saw, for instance, Chinese companies loaning employees to other companies. Not very common in labor markets. You lay people off, you furlough people. You don't loan your workforce to a competitor. But the idea of like having the possibility of resumption and continuity while looking after your people, while not losing their loyalty and goodwill. There was innovations like that. There were many innovations in the most affected sectors, in the hospitality sector. So, for instance, Airbnb, the hotel-less accommodation company, was as hard hit as conventional hotel chains when people stopped staying in hotels and stopped traveling. But they of course had the digital data on their entire portfolio, and they could see that actually the effect was very different in different types of locations. So they saw actually an increase in demand, or a relative increase in demand, in rural or isolated locations. They didn't have enough of those properties in their portfolio, but they very quickly retooled their portfolio so that that became a bigger weighting in their portfolio. And not surprisingly, as a result of that, we're able to come out of the crisis faster than other companies. Chuck E. Cheese, the sort of kids-oriented restaurant chain, one of their rapid adaptations was to start to loan out their kitchen facilities to delivery services, given that they were not going to fill the restaurants in conventional terms. And we saw a plethora of innovations across all sectors. The important thing is, of course, not to wait until something becomes a so-called trend, i.e. something that everybody knows about and everybody's doing, because the competitive advantage of doing something has already been arbitraged away. But to spot these, and it takes us back to this word anomaly, to spot the anomalous data points, which are the hints that something could become the case that isn't yet the case, the trigger for counterfactual thinking.
So just picking up on the first point there, in terms of the 3 steps of dealing with a crisis, and we're talking about the ability to soak up the shock and to absorb it. What I notice in that is the difference between organizations who make quick sense of what's going on and come to terms with those who are kind of waiting and paralyzed and going, I don't quite know what's happening and it's all overwhelming and I'll wait and see until it all comes clear. And I'm wondering about the connection between capacity for imagination and sense making, and whether there's a link there in your eyes.
Yes, I mean, sense. I often describe myself. So one of the interesting things about my profession, consulting, is one can frame what one does in different ways. And on some days, I think I'm in the business of sense making. Giving a plausible narrative, giving some meaning, some structure to a complex situation. I think that sense making is part of the cycle of harnessing imagination. There's a slight nuance, which is unfortunate, which sense making suggests that there is a sense, an objective sense of which can be made of reality. So it's like physics. What is the law of nature here? And certainly that's part of it, because you got to know, at what rate is demand dropping, and how does that vary segment by segment? There are facts to be had, but then there are anomalies, which is in messiness of reality. As the science fiction writer said, the future is often with us, but in a de-averaged form, not evenly distributed. The outlier behaviors. So the types of property that are increasing in accommodation demand, while on average, there's declining demand. That's sensing. That's almost like thinking like a novelist. You're not looking at averages. You're looking at details. And there's so that is an additional sense that we need to layer onto this sort of like law of nature type view of making sense. And then there, of course, there is the constructed reality, which is corporations don't have to take reality as a given. They, based upon their sense of what is possible but not yet the case, they can shape reality. So supposing, for example, that and this is often the case with these sorts of innovations we're talking about here, supposing that it's the case that rural accommodations show some positive signs, but it's not an inevitability that they'll increase in demand. It depends upon your ability to shape demand and sell a new narrative. Then you're not just sense taking, you're sense constructing. So in all of these senses, I think that sort of framing of taking the sense of things, looking at exceptions to the general sense of things, and constructing new senses and narratives, that's a key part of this.
Martin, I'm curious, with the rapid, evolution of technology and technological disruption, what role will technology play, or does technology play, in organizations reimagining themselves, or just in the future of imagination?
Well, in the early era of industrialization, mass production almost required, and in some cases, some of the early industrial pioneers even voiced this sentiment. It required workers to leave their opinions and their minds and their discernment at home, because the process needed to be followed efficiently, and that made sense in the context of that model. You didn't need philosophers on the production line. You needed people that followed instructions and were very careful and very industrious. And but these routine activities, mechanically routine or cognitively routine, things like accounting, these will almost certainly on fairly, I think in my view, a fairly rapid timescale be supplanted by algorithms and robots. Now, in order to calibrate that, one way of thinking about that is to say, well, what types of cognitive operation are we talking about? So the mathematician Judea Pearl distinguishes three types of cognitive operation. He talks about correlative thinking. Correlative thinking is, if I buy donuts, what else do I buy? I buy coffee. So machine learning is already better than human experts in many, many domains at correlative thinking, and including some pretty difficult ones. For instance, reading an X-ray. Reading an X-ray is not easy because everybody's kidneys are a slightly different shape, and the shadows could mean one thing or another thing. And but nevertheless, there are some papers saying that essentially machine learning, computer vision is already better than human experts at these sorts of tasks. And then we have causal thinking. Causal thinking is, do I buy coffee because I buy donuts, or do I buy donuts because I buy coffee? So machine learning can't do that now. Machine learning can't separate causes from effects. But this is, it's a longer story, but that's a quirk of how statistics developed and the statistics we currently have. But there's every prospect. We're well on the way to developing a new math for that. So that probably will be tractable to machine learning and artificial intelligence. And then we have counterfactual thinking, which is thinking about things that could be the case that are not the case. In other words, imagination. Well, anything like today's machine learning will never be able to do that, because machine learning cannot analyze the data which doesn't exist for the things that do not yet exist. This is still a very human propensity. And some companies, for instance, Google, has an explicit strategy of migrating human cognition to high levels of value added. They are deliberately saying, well, let us focus the humans on the stuff where they are genuinely advantaged, and let us, proactively replace the parts where they're not advantaged. So that potentially reshapes what a company does. So that all, I'll just add one more thing, which is an interesting idea, which is, so that raises the question, well, okay, so today's the artificial intelligence can't do imagination, but is it just a matter of time? And so we spoke to a lot of experts in the field, we surveyed the field, and our conclusion was that general artificial imagination is very, very far off. I mean, we don't see any prospect for it. It may there may be some breakthrough at some stage, but we don't see any prospect for that. So we don't think that's an immediate danger. And in fact, we see the opposite. We see that enormous scope for complementing everything we talked about in the book in terms of harnessing imagination with new analytical tools and techniques. So I just wrote a piece for Harvard Business Review with the CEO of a leading analytics company, NetBase Quid, for example, where we talk about using tools like theirs to facilitate the process of anomaly detection. So if imagination starts with surprise, how do we find surprise? Well, human beings can find the needle in a pincushion. They can't find the needle in a haystack, but a good semantic search algorithm and visualization algorithm can. So here, technology can help us to imagine. Equally, when we talked about codification, we did it 57 ways. We implemented the new idea in 57 ways, and 13 of them were successful. What's the common denominator? What are the key essential criteria for replicating success of an idea? That's a pattern recognition problem. Artificial intelligence can help us with that. So we came to the conclusion that will humans be supplanted by artificial intelligence in this or that occupation? We actually came to the conclusion that it was the wrong question, and we came more to the view that there is a socio-technical system. The humans invented the algorithms to pursue human ends, and human jobs consist of many processes and procedures, and we've suggested some new ones, and in some of those there'll be substitution, in other places complementation, but we must think about the socio-technical system as a whole and not just this simple question of how much substitution when.
It's fascinating. Thank you.
So, to bring our time together to a close, can you give us a sense of the priorities that leaders should be thinking about? What are the specific things that they should be doing today more of than they're not doing right now to imbue their organizations with a greater sense of imagination at a cultural and a capability level?
So I think the leaders of large companies should be thinking about reinvention and reimagination as much as performing under the current paradigm. So make sure you're balanced with respect to present and future. I think the rethinking organization along the lines that we've discussed and in the context of changing technology. What exactly do we mean by organization? Today, organization sort of loosely means some sort of hierarchy of people and with defined roles that execute a given task efficiently. Increasingly we need to start thinking about organizations as doing two things. One of them is combining human and machine intelligence synergistically, and the second one is having organizations have a generative property, able to execute today's tasks, but also generate tomorrow's missions and tasks. So rethinking organization, and I won't reiterate anything we've already said, but leading for imaginativeness and revitalization and vitality, and establishing a culture that permits everything we talked about today to be possible, as opposed to the overly financialized, efficiency obsessed organization that is mostly focused on executing yesterday's business model with ever increasing levels of efficiency.
Well, I think that has been an amazing conversation, and you've given us very generously a big insight into your ideas and your book. Thoroughly can recommend The Imagination Machine by Martin Reeves and Jack Fuller. It's a great read, and as you've heard, there's a lot of very practical, there's very inspiring ideas in there to rethink imagination within your organization, but there's lots of practical stuff that you can get operationalized the thinking quickly. So thank you, Martin. It's been a wonderful hour with you.
Yeah,
thank you,
Martin.
Scott and John. I appreciate the invite and the opportunity to talk.
Until next time, remember the world is evolving. Are you?